They don't realize it in the moment, but one day, silence will say everything you once meant to them. And in that silence, Carl Jung's idea becomes real, not as theory, but as emotional truth they can't escape anymore. Welcome to the Jungian path, where we explore deep psychological truths inspired by Carl Jung, uncovering the hidden emotions, patterns, and realizations that shape human relationships and inner growth. The pain doesn't arrive immediately. At first, they feel relief, distraction, even confidence that they made the right choice. Life moves forward, conversations change, and new faces appear. But slowly, something begins to feel different. The comfort they once had is gone. No one understands their silence the same way. No one notices the small changes in their mood. This is when the realization starts forming, quietly and without warning.
They begin to remember how you stayed during difficult moments. You didn't disappear when things became complicated. You didn't pull away when they were distant or unsure. You remained steady, offering patience instead of pressure. At the time, this felt ordinary to them. They assumed love like that was easy to find. But now, every interaction feels lighter, less grounded, less sincere.
The deeper the reflection becomes, the more they understand what they lost. It wasn't just affection. It was emotional safety. You saw their flaws and still chose to care. You accepted parts of them they rarely showed anyone else. That kind of understanding cannot be recreated quickly. It builds slowly, over time, through presence and consistency. When this truth finally settles in, it doesn't create anger. It creates a quiet ache. They recognize that the depth they once had is gone, and that realization stays with them longer than they expected. Some connections feel exciting at the surface. There are laughs, compliments, and moments that look perfect from the outside. But emotional depth is different. It's not about constant excitement. It's about understanding someone beyond what they show to the world. You offered something deeper.
You paid attention to the quiet pauses, the hidden worries, and the things they never said directly. You learned their patterns, their fears, and the small details that made them feel safe. When love stays at the surface, it often fades quickly. Conversations repeat, emotions stay shallow, and the bond never fully grows. They may meet people who are kind and interesting, but something feels incomplete. There's no sense of being truly seen. There's no calm feeling that someone understands them without long explanations. This is where the difference becomes clear. Depth creates a sense of grounding, while surface affection only creates temporary comfort.
You didn't just react to their words. You noticed their tone, their silence, and even their distance. You adjusted without making them feel judged. That kind of presence creates trust slowly, almost invisibly. At the time, they may not have recognized it. They may have confused deep love with something ordinary. But later, when they compare, they start to understand. They realize that emotional depth isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet and steady. It holds space instead of demanding attention. And when it's gone, the absence feels heavier than expected. They begin to see that what you gave wasn't just affection, but a rare level of connection that doesn't easily repeat. Taking love for granted doesn't usually happen in one moment. It builds slowly, almost invisibly.
At first, people don't recognize the value of what they have because it feels stable. When someone is always there, always understanding, and always patient, the mind starts to assume that this is just how things are supposed to be. There's no urgency to appreciate it, because it feels secure. But security is often mistaken for something that will never change. You gave consistency when it wasn't easy. You showed up even when emotions were unclear, even when appreciation wasn't always expressed. Over time, they started to rely on your presence without fully realizing what it took for you to stay that steady. Small gestures stopped being noticed. Efforts became expected instead of valued. The emotional balance shifted without them noticing it happening.
The mind often fails to recognize value when something is always available. Only distance creates clarity. Once you stepped back or left, the absence started to speak louder than your presence ever did. That's when memory begins to reorganize itself. Moments that once felt normal now start to feel meaningful. Conversations that were once taken lightly now carry weight. Regret doesn't appear as panic at first. It appears as reflection. They begin to replay situations where they could have shown more care, more attention, more appreciation. And slowly, it becomes clear that what they thought would always be there is no longer accessible in the same way. That realization is what makes taking love for granted so powerful in hindsight. It teaches them that not every form of love returns once it is ignored or underestimated. A psychological awakening doesn't happen like a sudden explosion.
It's more like a slow shift in awareness. At first, the person may feel nothing unusual after the separation or emotional distance. Life continues, distractions fill the space, and they believe they have moved on. But deep inside, something begins to change quietly. Their mind starts comparing past emotional experiences with present ones, even when they don't fully intend to.
This awakening begins when their current emotional reality feels slightly off. Not painful at first, just incomplete. Conversations don't feel as natural. Support doesn't feel as grounding. Even attention from others doesn't land in the same way. This creates a subtle tension inside them, a sense that something meaningful is missing, but they cannot immediately name it. Slowly, memory becomes more active. The mind starts replaying specific moments, not the big events, but the small emotional details. How they felt understood in silence, how someone noticed their mood without being told, how comfort felt effortless rather than requested. These recollections begin to form contrast with their present experiences. This is where awareness deepens.
They don't just remember you as a person. They start recognizing the emotional role you played in their life. They begin to see that you weren't just present physically, you were emotionally aligned with them in ways they didn't fully appreciate at the time. The awakening is not dramatic. It is reflective and quiet. It doesn't come with immediate action, but with understanding.
And once that understanding forms, it changes how they interpret every connection that follows. Because now they know what depth actually feels like, even in its absence. Losing unconditional acceptance is one of those experiences that only becomes clear after it is gone. While it is present, it doesn't always stand out because it feels safe and steady. You don't question it much. You don't feel the need to earn it every day. It's there even when you are not at your best, even when your moods change, even when you are difficult to understand. That kind of acceptance creates a quiet emotional shelter that many people only recognize later, in contrast to what comes after. When someone is deeply accepted, they don't have to constantly perform or prove their worth. They can be flawed, uncertain, or emotionally inconsistent, yet still feel held in a calm way. You offered that kind of space. You didn't withdraw love every time things became complicated.
You didn't make affection conditional on perfection. Instead, you stayed emotionally open even when things were not easy. But once that presence is gone, the emotional environment changes. New connections often come with conditions, expectations, or emotional distance. Suddenly, people realize they are being measured more carefully. They feel the need to adjust themselves, to be more careful with their words, to manage how they appear. This shift creates an internal comparison, even if it is not spoken out loud.
That's when the absence of unconditional acceptance becomes noticeable. They start to feel the difference between being tolerated and being truly embraced. It is not about one person being better than another, but about the emotional freedom that was once there and is no longer available. And that realization often brings a quiet sense of loss that lingers in the background of their thoughts. Ego and genuine connection often look similar at the beginning, but they operate in completely different ways. Ego focuses on control, validation, and self-image. It cares about being right, being admired, or not feeling vulnerable. Genuine connection, on the other hand, is not interested in winning or proving anything. It is focused on understanding, emotional safety, and real presence between two people. When ego is involved in a relationship, conversations can become defensive.
Small misunderstandings turn into arguments because neither person wants to appear weak or wrong. The focus shifts away from us and moves toward me. In that space, emotional distance slowly grows, even if both people are physically close. There is interaction, but not true openness. People start holding back parts of themselves to protect their pride or image. You, however, offered something different. You leaned into understanding instead of control. You weren't trying to dominate the emotional space or constantly prove your value. You were more interested in connection than recognition. That creates a very different emotional atmosphere. It allows the other person to relax, to be imperfect, and to be seen without pressure.
But ego doesn't always recognize genuine connection in the moment. Sometimes it takes absence for clarity to form. When the emotional safety you provided is no longer there, the contrast becomes obvious. New interactions may feel more guarded, more performative, or less natural. That's when they begin to notice that what they once had wasn't based on ego games, but on something quieter and deeper. And once that difference is understood, it becomes hard to unsee how rare real emotional connection actually is when ego is no longer in the way. The shadow of regret doesn't appear immediately after loss. At first, there is often silence, distraction, or even a sense of relief. The mind protects itself by focusing on what feels easier in the moment. But as time passes and emotional noise settles, hidden thoughts begin to surface.
This is where regret slowly takes shape, not as something loud or dramatic, but as something quiet that sits in the background of their awareness. It often begins when they encounter situations that remind them of what once existed with you. It could be a small detail, a familiar tone in someone else's voice, or a moment where they feel misunderstood. These moments create contrast. They start comparing present experiences with past emotional safety, even without trying to.
Regret grows stronger when memory becomes selective. The mind starts highlighting the good moments more clearly than before. It replays conversations where they felt understood, supported, or emotionally seen. At the same time, it begins to soften or blur the reasons why they let it go. This imbalance creates inner tension, because what they feel now doesn't match what they once had. Unlike immediate sadness, regret is reflective. It doesn't demand action, but it changes perception. They begin to see their past choices differently. Things they once overlooked now feel significant. Effort they didn't value starts to feel rare. The most powerful part of this shadow is that it doesn't fully leave. It stays in quiet moments, shaping how they view new relationships. Even when life moves forward, a part of them remains aware of what was lost and not fully appreciated at the time.
Emotional absence after separation is not just about missing a person physically. It is about missing the emotional rhythm that person created in daily life. When someone has been deeply connected to another, their presence becomes part of emotional regulation, even in small ways.
You don't realize how often you relied on that calm voice, that understanding response, or that silent support, until it is no longer there. At first, the absence can feel like space or freedom. There is less emotional responsibility, fewer conversations, and no need to adjust to someone else's feelings. But over time, that silence starts to feel different. It stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling empty. The absence is not loud, but it becomes noticeable in moments that used to feel shared. They may find themselves wanting to talk about things they once shared with you. Simple thoughts, daily updates, or emotional reactions no longer have a natural place to go. Even when surrounded by people, there is a sense that something familiar is missing from their emotional environment. This is where emotional absence becomes powerful. It is not just the loss of interaction, but the loss of emotional grounding.
You were part of how they processed feelings, even without them realizing it. Your presence made certain emotions easier to handle, clearer to understand, or calmer to experience.
Without that influence, they start to notice emotional imbalance. Things feel slightly heavier or less understood. New interactions may not reach the same depth, and conversations may feel more surface level. That contrast slowly builds awareness of what used to exist and is no longer available in the same way. Memory becoming stronger than presence happens when time separates two people, but emotion refuses to fade at the same speed. In the beginning, presence dominates everything. When someone is still in your life, your attention is focused on daily interaction, habits, and routines. But once distance enters, memory slowly starts to take a different shape. It no longer feels like a simple recollection. It becomes something emotionally active. At first, memories appear randomly. A sound, a place, or even a small phrase can trigger a sudden recall.
These moments feel light, but over time they become more frequent and more vivid. The mind begins to highlight emotional details that were not fully noticed before. How someone made you feel safe, how they understood your silence, or how their presence reduced emotional tension without effort. As presence fades, memory gains emotional weight. It starts filling gaps that reality no longer covers. The mind revisits conversations, not just for information, but for meaning. It replays feelings more than events, and slowly, those remembered emotions begin to feel more stable than current experiences.
This shift creates an unusual contrast. Real-life interactions may feel less impactful compared to what is remembered. Even new people or situations might not fully replace the emotional depth that memory holds. This is not because the past is objectively better, but because memory filters out noise and preserves emotional intensity. Over time, memory becomes a kind of emotional reference point. It shapes how present experiences are judged. And when presence no longer carries the same depth, memory quietly takes over, becoming stronger, clearer, and more emotionally influential than what is currently happening in real life. Silence replacing intimacy is not just the absence of conversation, it is the disappearance of emotional connection that used to exist through words, tone, and shared presence. When two people are emotionally close, even silence between them feels alive.
It carries understanding, comfort, and unspoken communication. But when that bond breaks, silence changes its meaning completely. At first, the silence after separation may feel temporary. There is an expectation that messages will come again, or that the connection will somehow resume. But as time passes, that silence becomes longer and more consistent. It stops feeling like a pause and starts feeling like an ending that repeats itself every day.
This new silence carries weight because it replaces what once felt natural. There were moments when conversations flowed without effort, when even small updates felt important, and when emotional presence was felt through simple exchanges. Now, those spaces are empty. The absence of communication highlights what used to exist more clearly than words ever could. Over time, the mind begins to respond to this silence. It starts filling it with reflection, questions, and memory. They may wonder what you are thinking, how you are doing, or whether you still remember certain moments. But there is no response, only stillness. That stillness slowly becomes emotional pressure. Silence replacing intimacy also creates awareness of emotional value. It makes people realize how much connection was carried through simple interaction.
Without it, even daily life feels slightly less connected, as if something essential is missing but cannot be easily replaced or recreated in the same form. Growth through loss begins in a way that feels uncomfortable and confusing. When someone important leaves your emotional world, the first reaction is usually resistance. The mind tries to hold on, replay, or understand what went wrong. But over time, when answers don't fully satisfy the emotional gap, something starts to shift inside. The focus slowly moves from the person who is gone to the person who is left behind.
In the early stage, loss feels like emptiness. There is a sense of imbalance, as if something essential has been removed. But within that emptiness, reflection begins to grow. You start noticing patterns in your own behavior, how you loved, how you reacted, and how much of yourself you gave without even thinking about it. This is where awareness starts forming. As days pass, emotional intensity reduces slightly, allowing clarity to enter. You begin to see situations differently. Things that once felt overwhelming now feel like lessons. You realize where you stayed too long, where you ignored your own needs, and where you depended too heavily on someone else's presence for emotional stability. Growth doesn't mean forgetting. It means understanding without emotional distortion. You stop seeing only pain and start seeing insight. The experience that once broke you begins to shape you.
Reflective, you become more aware of boundaries, self-worth, and emotional balance. Eventually, loss becomes a turning point, rather than just an ending. It teaches emotional independence, not through choice, but through experience. And even though it arrives through pain, it slowly builds a stronger, more self-aware version of you who no longer sees love in the same unconscious way as before. Facing truth without emotional escape is one of the hardest moments for any person because it removes the comfort of denial. At first, the mind tries to avoid it. It creates distractions, justifications, or alternative stories that feel easier to accept. People often protect themselves by believing things ended for simple reasons or that what was lost was not as important as it once felt. This emotional escape is a way to reduce inner discomfort.
But truth has a way of returning when silence becomes stronger than distraction. In quiet moments, when there is no external noise, reality starts to surface. It is not forced, it simply becomes clearer. They begin to see situations as they actually were, not as they wished them to be. This can feel heavy because it removes emotional cushioning. Without escape, they start recognizing their own role in what happened. Not in a harsh or blaming way, but in an honest way. They see moments where they didn't appreciate enough, where they misunderstood depth, or where they assumed emotional stability would always remain. This awareness can be uncomfortable, but it is also honest. What makes this stage powerful is that there is no longer anything to hide behind. No more distractions that fully erase thought, no more excuses that completely dissolve responsibility. Only understanding remains.
And in that understanding, emotional clarity begins to form. They realize that truth doesn't always hurt to punish, but to reveal. It shows what was real, what was overlooked, and what cannot be repeated in the same way again once awareness finally settles in completely.
In the end, this isn't about blame or victory. It is about realization. Carl Jung often pointed toward the idea that truth arrives when the mind can no longer avoid itself. And in relationships, that moment comes quietly, when silence replaces emotion and memory becomes heavier than presence. What once felt ordinary begins to reveal its depth, and what was taken for granted slowly turns into understanding. They don't wake up suddenly with all the answers. It happens gradually, through reflection, through contrast, through emotional absence. One day, they simply recognize that the kind of love they experienced was not common, not replaceable, and not easily recreated. And that recognition doesn't always bring peace at first. It brings awareness. Because truth has its own weight. It doesn't shout, it settles. It shows people what they had, what they missed, and what they can no longer return to in the same way.
And in that space of awareness, growth begins. Not because everything is fixed, but because everything is finally seen clearly without illusion. That is where the real shift happens, not in holding on, not in letting go, but in understanding.
If this message resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Jungian Path for more deep psychological insights like this. And hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. And in the comments, drop the word "awakened" if you truly felt the depth of this message and connected with its truth.